Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full Prefrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function. I'm your host, Sucheta Kamath, and I believe having these conversations about important topic of executive function, how the self-regulation works, how do we guide our thinking, our behaviors and actions by in a self-enlightened way so that we can achieve our goals and allow other people to achieve their goals as well. And there's so many important things that go into understanding executive function and creating communities where people have very strong executive function, because executive function can also be the backbone of morality, critical decision making, and taking a perspective of the other. I kind of want to share with you some of the symptoms or signs or behaviors of children, adults, or adolescents with underdeveloped executive function. What do they do when our executive function skills are not sharp or on par? You tend to be impulsive, easily distracted, act without thinking. You easily forget goals, dislike effortful tasks, or lack persistence. There's a low level of frustration tolerance and high interpersonal conflict. Often, those individuals tend to go for risky things. And I like to call the below the radar risky things, which is not turning in homework is a risky thing, right? Not preparing for a test is also a risky thing. So one risky thing may be speeding when at that bend cop tends to be. And poor problem solving, lack of self-correction, and requiring constant attention or motivation from an adult if you're a child, but also if you're an adult, requiring a lot of nudging from your contemporaries, peers, or your spouses or bosses. So with that in mind, is our understanding of executive function clear and concrete as we think it is, or is there any role racial bias plays? Because are we seeing certain groups to not be capable of doing these things well, or are we faulting them for their dysregulation as if it is a character flaw? And those are very important topics that I like to dive deep into. And that's why we have a very special guest today, Dr. Willie McBride. He is a new assistant professor with Spalding University School of Professional Psychology, where he is the Adult Emphasis Neuropsychology Director. He finished his 2-year fellowship with the neuropsychology department within the University of Virginia Health System. He also serves as the treasurer for the Society for Black Neuropsychology, which we're going to talk to him about. And he also previously completed a fellowship in interprofessional psychology at the Tennessee Valley Healthcare System in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. One of the reasons I'm really excited to talk to him about, because his research interests include neuropsychological practice with minority communities, forensic neuropsychology, and personality. He is originally from Louisville, Kentucky, and not to stereotype, but he does enjoy vinyl records, video games, and loves to debate the merits of anime as a national pastime. Oh my God, I can't wait to hear more about that. So with all that said, it's going to be a very delightful conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Willie. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
So I don't know which direction to go first. So I'll start what I do with my psychology friends. I would love to know how your executive function skills were when you were a child in a middle school and high school. And how would you describe your own self-awareness and strategic thinking when it came to managing your learning?
Oh, wow. How much time do you have? As you were reading off all of those issues that kids or adolescents or even in adulthood we have with executive functioning, I was thinking about, I had that one, I had that issue. So it's very interesting to hear those things. But for me personally, I was always a high achieving kid. Growing up, I think there's a difference between like, you study hard, but then some things come naturally to you as well. And
Yes.
I did study hard, but then there were just things that just kind of came intuitive. And I tended to rely on the intuitive stuff, and I always did good, like at least a B, in terms of grades and things like that. And I would get my A's as well, but I always thought about that I could be pushing myself a little bit harder and I could be doing a little bit more. And I'm like, why am I not like 4.0? I wasn't that student who was a 4.0 student, and it was like I was a procrastinator. Even with how great I did, and as a PhD doctor, I still had those moments of procrastination where it was like, hey, I'm doing really good. I don't know if I want to push myself as far as I could go. And it was like, sometimes it was like procrastination. I would wait to the last minute. And, I struggled in those things in terms of, I think people have the misconception that high achieving people can't struggle with
Yes.
executive functioning issues. We just happen to be high achieving as well. And I hope that doesn't come off as a little narcissistic, but it's like that's what I was. I was high achieving. I probably could have done exponentially better, but I was like, I'm just, I don't feel like it sometimes. I'll wait to the last minute. I've read it before. I know what I need to do. Those types of things used to come out.
You know what's so interesting as you're saying that, and I know we'll get to the meat of your expertise, but I think when we talk about personal competence, high motivation, which kind of helps you sustain effort, but just because you're sustaining effort, you may not be strategic. So to me, that's the kind of piece that you're talking about, that you can have. When you develop your high level of executive function, you become very strategic. So you're impactful with your effort. So sounds like you were smart, talented. You saw the rewards, and you continued to see the benefit of your hard work, but you were not consistent or strategic, is what comes to mind.
Yeah, I was not strategic as much as I could be, and then I knew exactly what I needed to do to get the good grades, but not necessarily to push myself beyond those limits of where I could really be going to like maximize that potential. Absolutely.
So let's dive into this question of neuropsychology.
Mhm.
Explain to our audience, what does the field of neuropsychology mean, and what do you, as a neuropsychologist, do? I have had lifelong relationships with neuropsychologists, which has been one of my favorite partnerships, because based on those findings, I'm able to construct a treatment plan. So, and
Mhm.
secondly, what are you passionate about when it comes to neuropsychology?
Mhm.
How did you discover that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, neuropsychology is a subspecialty of psychology in general. I mean, there's a number of different subspecialties that you could go into. It's like a rabbit hole. But neuropsychology, the broad focus is the study of brain and behavior. Okay, brain behavior relationships. So we look at anatomical regions of the brain. We look at what correlations we can see. So if somebody has deficits in what we call the prefrontal lobes, the areas in the front part of the brain, that speaks to executive functioning dysfunction. So what neuropsychologists do, specifically clinical neuropsychologists. So we work in clinical populations, we work in hospitals, private practice, school settings. We work with people that have dysfunction of the brain. And so, where I did the bulk of my training is working with people with older age issues that are related to dysfunction of the brain. So, Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, stroke, all of those things impact the brain emotionally, our ability to process information. And so, what I do is I help neurologists, I help primary care doctors figure out the severity of those issues. So for instance, we can take an image of the brain, right? We can do a CT scan, we can do an MRI, we can do an X-ray, we can get all of these images of the brain, and you can actually see where there might be dysfunction. You can see evidence of a stroke. You can see evidence of a brain tumor, or other things, but that can't tell you what that's going to look like in that person's day-to-day life, right?
Mm.
Those are not a one-to-one correlation. So what neuropsychologists do is that we help figure out, okay, how severe is this person's memory deficits going to be? How severe is their inability to inhibit what they say or plan, how severe are those things going to interfere with their life? And so that's the bulk of my work is doing evaluations and doing assessments of people who have those difficulties. I enjoy my job. I love just the mystery of the brain. When somebody comes into my room or into my evaluation clinic and they have concerns for dementia, or is it dementia or depression? I love exploring about what is actually causing the issues that they're having. I think of it as a puzzle. I think of it as, I'm an investigator. I get to ask a lot of questions that they're not usually prepared for. And then I love being able to do the testing and the evaluation to see how those things line up. So I like the inquisitive aspect of it. And I just like the brain. It's just such a cool organ. There's so much that comes from it. And we're still learning more about how it works. So that's kind of like, I nerd out when I talk about, things related to the brain. So I enjoy it all around.
Well, I think and it truly comes through your passion for this investigative attitude. That great curiosity, problem solving, and I share that with you. I think I was wondering, in education. And me, for me, coming from a speech language pathology perspective on impaired brain, also helping people regain their skills and strength has been my path. But when I look at education and children, we have psychoeducational battery or psychologists who assess the relationship between teaching and learning versus neuropsychology, which is the brain behavior relationship. What are your thoughts about we need to know a lot more about the brain, because learning how to learn is really the key to unlock your own ability as a learner and thinker. But when we look at the testing or evaluate somebody for struggles, we are always saying, did learning take place? So we are looking at, what your level of math competence is, what your level of reading is. So what are your thoughts about we not doing that enough in schools? Or do you feel comfortable commenting on that?
Well, I don't do a lot of my work in schools, but what I would say is that I absolutely agree with you in that thinking about the individual and learning styles from not just the individual, but culturally, how people are reared in the home and how people learn, where do they start learning how to learn? And that's typically done in the home. And so if you have cultural differences in how people learn, and then you
Can you
put
give
them
an
in an
example for our audience?
well, sure. Like, for just like African American children, there are differences in how their learning styles are in terms of more active learning. It's not just sitting down and reading, but there's a lot of physical play and just different things in that aspect. For instance, from a cultural perspective of Western culture or Western, like United States culture, the tests that we use, looking at what we call processing speed. And a lot of our tests look at how quickly can you do something in this certain amount of time? Can you complete this task quickly and efficiently? Our culture is designed and looks at getting things done quickly. If you go to a restaurant, it's like, okay, how many people can you get in to go into that restaurant? But if we go to other cultures, where speed and getting things done as quickly as possible is not a priority, you see that actually most people, even if you give them a test where they say, hey, finish this really quickly, they're going to prioritize accuracy and taking their time over speed. And that's not a bad thing, right? That doesn't mean that someone has a deficit because they take more of their time. And so I think we need to rethink, it's not a one size fit all for educational background or educational learning styles. We need to be more mindful of individual learning styles and how do we fit our teaching methods to that child or adolescent.
Wow. I really appreciate you kind of making a reference to the cultural component, which is, again, I think in our field is new. I feel,
Hmm.
most of psychology also began as a deficit based. How can we address deficits versus now looking at the larger development of how people gain skills and knowledge. And, I myself coming from being born and raised in another country and then
Hmm.
migrating to another has given me great insight into how cultures operate. And for example, work is non-negotiable. So there is no can I do this later. This concept just doesn't exist at home. So
Right.
when parents says do it now, do it, and you must do it, there's no, it's not negotiable.
Right.
And second thing, for example, doing work around the house comes before your schoolwork. So you
Mm.
cannot say I have schoolwork, hence I cannot help. That is non-negotiable. So I remember we when I was growing up, we had a very intense, like, state board exam. Okay, like it's like I don't even know what your equivalent test would be here, but the most difficult test, national test, if you want to get into college. And the night before my test, my parents still required me to set the table, do the dishes, help out with the mopping, and then they say, okay, now you're free to go to study.
Can I get a break just this one night? Like just this once, just this once.
And what I found though, I think that was such a profoundly that made such an impact on me, because I think like you are always part of a community, and your community depends on you, and your goals are secondary to the community's goals. It was really important. And now I see just the opposite in my private practice. For example, the parents are like dropping the projects off, or they're taking the homework that was left on the table, I mean, and the kids are absolutely, their plates are in their bedroom because the parents have served dinner there, those kinds of things. I'm not knocking anybody out, but I do think there can be a cultural tone that sets the expectation. So violating expectations is a failure of executive function, or is failure to expect executive function proficiency.
I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think it's probably the latter, in terms of like just kind of thinking about our conceptualization of executive functioning. Like, what are we really talking about? It's this, even in the neuropsychology, I'm sure you know this, in the neuropsychology world, there's debate about using the term executive functioning to describe this entirety of just multiple abilities and tasks, and just like, what are we really talking about here? And I don't think there's a consensus on executive functioning, so you're going to hear a lot of different perspectives on it if you talk to a number of different people. Hence this podcast absolutely is being needed, because you have so many perspectives on it.
Yeah, so I think maybe, in your opinion, how do you see, how should we understand executive function? And, you particularly are interested in minority communities. And how do you see the proficiency or lack of proficiency in executive function seen in that particular community, which is we don't need to leave the country right here?
Mhm.
So share that with us.
Well, I think of executive functioning. I would say that, from my own perspective and just kind of my own study, there's levels to executive functioning. You have your, I would say, basic building blocks: attention, working memory, processing speed. I would guess lower order executive functioning abilities. But then you have higher order executive functioning abilities. So, can you inhibit a thought or inhibit impulsive behaviors? Can you multitask, switch between two opposing things? Two people are talking in your ear. Can you, block out what's one person saying and focus on your attention there? And then thinking about planning, foresight, judgment, decision making. Those involve a lot of different processes that not only rely on your frontal lobes, which is the area where we think of executive functioning being housed. If, let's say, judgment or decision making, okay, judgment, decision making, making a rational choice based on ideas or things that we learn, where does that information come from? Where is that information stored? Like the ideas of, okay, I shouldn't cross the street, right? We use those types of questions. I should look both ways before I cross the street. But where does that knowledge of crossing the street come from, right? That's not housed in the frontal lobes. That might be in the deeper parts of the brain in our memory storage banks, where it's like, hey, somebody told us that we shouldn't cross the street. And so now we're having to use our frontal lobes to go grab that information. So it's a multi-system process, right? And the frontal lobes is probably what my supervisors used to call, and I'm going to quote her, is like the CEO of the brain.
Yes.
That's the area that does all of those things, that relies on all of those other parts of the brain to organize and make those decisions. When it comes to, the culture that I guess I would represent in terms of the African American culture, I've seen some troubling things just in terms of when, let's take children who have what we would call executive functioning difficulties. They're impulsive. They can't sit still in their seats. They're inattentive, what we would call probably ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There has been research that has shown that when you look at matching, and I'm paraphrasing, teachers who are of a different race, and they have students in front of them who are African American, they're more likely to recommend them for, behavioral disruptive classes or special education rather than, gifted education or things like that. And so you see this, what is the reason for that? What is the thing that is causing that issue to happen? And I think it's expectations and understanding of what executive functioning looks like in people who are of a different background or a cultural background. So I see that, African American kids tend to be labeled more as disruptive, problematic, behaviorally disorganized, and not effective learners. But I think that there are some other things that are going on that impact that we need to address, which is, I think, a lot of bias.
And so, even can you maybe extend that, how that this may show up in adult world, as you and I deal with clients, minority clients. And again, I don't know about your profession, but my profession, for example, is 95% is predominantly white. And the field of speech language pathology is in service, providing service to people of all sorts of communities. And so understanding that is really critical. But you may not have the greatest understanding about, I'll give my example, and this is nothing to, I tell people I became brown after coming to this country, but, when I was growing up in India, I was like all shades of brown,
Right.
But I do remember I was young and naive and was not married, but I had a patient who had a stroke, and she was during childbirth. And so her baby and the mother were wheeled into our department, and she had a stroke. And there was the family was from different culture than I was. In India, it's like a mini Europe, I like to say. Different regions of India is different practices, and they all were very. They also were from the rural part of Bombay, and so when they came, and we talked about therapy. Their first pushback was, she doesn't need to speak. We'll take care of her. So what it meant was like, we will never leave our own alone. But if you didn't understand that context, it might sound like she doesn't have any identity or she doesn't have any need. So her disability now is permanent. So we're going to walk away. So if you didn't take that time to understand what that cultural reference meant, you could misunderstand that interaction. And so any thoughts about how this comes up in the adult interactions, serving the needs of various communities?
Well, I would say that I think it's a there's so many ways you could go with that in the sense. So like, let's start still with those kids. So I referenced the study, and I'm blanking on the authors, but um, if those kids, those African American kids, are placed in special education or education that is not whatever is standard, that impacts their developmental growth, educational growth as they matriculate through school. They still may graduate high school. But we're learning, particularly for African Americans, is that quality of education. In the test that we use as neuropsychologists, we have to use norms with normative data. So when I'm seeing someone in my clinic, I'm having to use, like, they get a certain set of scores. Let's say I give them a memory test and they remember 5 words. Okay, what does that score mean, right? What does that 5 words
Yes.
mean? Is that a good score? Is that a bad score?
Yeah.
Is that a great score? And we have to norm these tests. The people who create these tests, they did all of this psychometric research and they normed them, and they got a group of people who they said, hey, these are our normal people and these are people who are impaired. And if you get a score here compared to normal people, that means you're in this range: average, low average, above average, etc. But what we're learning is that, for one, a lot of these tests don't have really great norms for minority
Cultural
groups.
norms, yes.
Right. African Americans, absolutely. Latino groups, any culture outside of the majority culture, the norms aren't usually that great. And so, we're thinking about the quality of education and how that is a better indicator of people's functioning later on. Those kids who become adults who have had that lack of quality of education, that's going to impact their ability to, have good jobs. That's going to impact, particularly if they, have later behavioral issues that could lead them into juvenile justice system or in the criminal justice system. Um, you know, I could imagine that if you look in the criminal justice system, a lot of those people who are incarcerated have had a history of learning difficulties and been held back and have had so many different things. So thinking about it from just the perspective of what it leads to, that ultimate negative side is that not having great learning, being taught how to learn efficiently, can impact your ability to do so much in the rest of your life, even just having quality life.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and so such a thoughtful way of considering that, and that actually brings me to another perspective here. I would love to hear what you think. We know from the work done by psychiatrist and author of The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk, that children and adults who have experienced traumatic experiences adapt to life and learning far differently than those who haven't experienced such things. So, should there be any special considerations given to children whose childhood experiences have social cultural bearing that may have induced trauma, including racial discrimination?
Absolutely. Yes, 100% yes. We know ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. That's not my area of expertise necessarily, but the literature shows that those childhood traumatic events, and that's not just when we think about what I think about typically as, emotional, verbal, physical, sexual abuse, but poverty, lack of, food, homelessness. There are a number of children out there that are experiencing inconsistent housing. So all of these things, air pollution, all of these things that create health disparities, they absolutely impact the development. You mentioned one of my fellowships, the interprofessional fellowship, and that was at a veterans hospital, right? So I'm working with veterans who have experienced trauma as more than likely related to military combat. And we know what that does to the brain. It impacts executive functioning. It impacts memory, emotional regulation. What do people think is going to happen to children who are experiencing these things on a daily and yearly basis? an example I'll use is that, a young African American kid who's coming to school, he's coming to school because he needs to get food, right? That's where
Yes.
he's getting consistent meals every day. And he doesn't get food at home. And so he's thinking about, his mind is not necessarily on learning necessarily, right? Can we fault him or her for that not being a priority when there's so much food insecurity in that person's life? So no, we can't just think that we cannot overlook those aspects and those factors and how they significantly impact the development of young brains, old brains, all brains.
And I think as more and more I read about different ways the outcomes, like life outcomes, or scholastic outcomes, or the America's ranking in the world. It just breaks my heart that we have not paid great attention to impact of poverty and poverty in America, and the kind of support that we have determined is adequate for people in poverty. Somehow there is a colloquial wisdom that goes into it, thinking that people have inflicted poverty on themselves by making poor choices. And also people have lack of motivation to not demonstrate a vigor to pull themselves out of poverty by pulling themselves with the bootstraps. And so there's an incredible structural disadvantages that are not paid proper attention to. Do you have any thoughts about what are we not getting right when it comes to the way we design support for people? Because support also has this sort of fundamental belief of deservedness. Who deserves support and opportunity for change versus who doesn't. And secondly, I don't know about your field, but in my field, everything is driven by insurance or private pay, right? So insurance, whether it's children, then the way we have structured receiving therapy or executive function intervention comes from schooling or as a private practitioner, or it is something that as a tutor, right? So that all is now tied into affordability. So the very skill that needs to be improved with help, you need experts, but those experts are not accessible. So I'm wondering what your, sorry for my little drawn out question.
No. I think that there needs to be an overhaul of multiple systems that play a role. Health system, in terms of what you described, in terms of insurance and the coverage that the resources that are available to people who don't have those resources and have to be on, maybe government assistance or government funded insurance. Though, helping to fix poverty is a really labor intensive thing.
Yes.
And it's really hard. And so I don't know if our system is designed to really put the amount of resources that are needed to help make changes. There's a multi-system family therapy is a type of therapy that where it focuses on family, but it focuses on let's say a child who's having trouble in school or at home, but it uses the resources of the community around that child. So it could be the parents, but also the grandparents, aunts, uncles, football coach or counselor at school, so it's like you're involving multiple people in the care of this one individual. And that takes a lot of time and resources. And, I don't think that the system is designed that way at this moment, but I think it should change. I wish I could come up with a solution that would fix everything. But I think in terms of just kind of putting more money and resources to helping these communities, we would see a lot of changes there. We know what's the root of a lot of these things. It is these adverse childhood experiences. The research shows that. The psychology research shows that, in terms of what that does for the development and mental health issues. And so I think that if we don't start changing those systems from a policy, state, and federal level, we're going to be trying to push back on a system that is just going to continue.
Yeah, that just reminds me of a study by Hare and his colleagues who found that children living in a household just above the federal poverty level had grave matter volume 3 to 4 percentage points below the norm. And then children living below the federal poverty line, their gray matter volume was 8 to 10% below the norm. Then eventually what happens is this leads to these kids performing 4 to 7 points worse on standardized tests off the start, and the single reason is poverty. So the brain has
Yeah.
not had an opportunity to grow, and nothing to do with core capacity or intelligence for sure.
And so, and that leads into, there are a number of studies that look at something we call cognitive reserve,
Yes.
meaning the faculties that help kind of stave off cognitive decline as we get older. And so if you're already starting out with that handicap or that disadvantage, what does that mean for the trajectory of your brain long term, right? And what does that mean if you do get a stroke or if you do get some injury to the brain? That means that if you had that cognitive reserve, that might protect you more. But because you're already starting out with such a handicap, that doesn't bode well for those individuals.
So another interesting thing you have done, which is so important and vital, is you and your colleagues co-founded the Society for Black Neuropsychology, which is an organization of neuropsychologists, trainees, and students interested in promoting the discipline and practice of neuropsychology as it pertains to Black population. So tell us more about your reasons to engage in this work.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was all birthed out of an idea from a friend of ours who is actually, ironically, no longer in neuropsychology. But we were all at a neuropsychology conference, I believe in Washington, D.C. This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And so we were just looking around, and it was one of the few times where I'd seen that many Black trainees, Black students, Black neuropsychologists all in one place. And so we kind of came up and like, hey, why isn't there organization devoted towards the advancing neuropsychology as it relates to Black communities? And so we started putting our heads together and started creating the organization and creating all of the stuff you need for an organization, the articles of incorporation and the bylaws. And so we planned it for such a long time, and like, this is what we want the organization to do. And so we actually launched, I think, at the height of the COVID pandemic, around the time that Breonna Taylor was murdered, and George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery. And so it was this fortuitous time where Society for Black Neuropsychology, SBN, came to life. And so our goal is to ideally just be a place, a home for students, trainees, and neuropsychologists who all identify as Black, and not just African American, but if you are Caribbean descent, if you are from Africa, if you are from the Netherlands and you identify as a Black individual, we know that there is a need for neuropsychology services, research, providers for Black communities. African Americans specifically, have higher rates of Alzheimer's disease. They have some of the highest rates of health disparities as well. So all of those things impact the brain later on. I make the joke that you can get a heart transplant if you're lucky enough. In terms of just being a right candidate, the right timing. That's something that modern medicine can do. Right? We're not at a place where we can replace your brain. Right?
No.
Elon Musk has not figured out a way to transfer consciousness to a computer. He's working on it, but we're not there yet. So until that time comes, we only have the faculties that we have. And so I want to talk to people about taking better care of their brain because, without that, everything else, we can't do a lot of other things. Yeah.
So what do you particularly see this investment in increasing the representation of Black neuropsychologists? What kind of impact would it have on the population that we are serving?
Well, there are a number of things, and there are a number of researchers that have been doing this work a lot longer than I have, and are experts in the field. Jennifer Manley, Desiree Bird, Monica Rivera-Mint. Those are some neuropsychologists who have been doing work on just cultural neuropsychology, looking at education, looking at diversity issues. And so neuropsychology, as it relates to the Black community, it can lead to better outcomes for those individuals. So I like to give talks in the community that I'm so. So I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm back in Louisville, Kentucky. And so my heart, my passion, and my goal is to get in front of as many Black communities as I can to tell them, like, hey, once you get to a certain age, you need to start looking at, going to see a neurologist and going to have neuropsychological evaluations. This is why it's important to take better care of your brain. We know that African Americans tend to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and dementia at a later point, right? So their progression of neurodegeneration is a lot farther along when they get that first diagnosis, or even when they get in front of a neurologist. And so that means that maybe those resources or tools that we could use to help them are not there because they're farther along in the disease progression, right? And so, the outcomes are worse. If we have more Black neuropsychologists, we know that oftentimes African Americans are misdiagnosed with dementia at a higher rate. So it's both things. They're not given the diagnosis when they need it, and then they're also misdiagnosed because we know that the tests don't necessarily always tap into the deficits that are impacting Black communities. So just in terms of having providers that know more about you and have your are impacting your community, we need that. And we know that would be very important.
So as we think about, working with diverse population and really trying to serve the needs of all by improving our understanding and creating appropriate cultural context, this concept that was proposed by McCormick Hunn and their colleagues, which is a perspective-taking, idea. And so it's called intersectional thinking for advocating for social change. And I know you're very interested in that. So I was wondering if you can talk about how to apply that framework, which is, for perspective, for ideas to shift our perspective, to engage in thinking that people are not this, one identity. There's multiple factors that have a role to play.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can say this, and I say this jokingly, but also with some seriousness as well, is that we as humans, we're somewhat lazy in some aspects, in that we like to categorize things in a way that makes it easy for our brain to just like, okay, this is what I'm looking at. I see it. I know what it is. And so that we don't have to do as much thinking about things. And I think when we think about, particularly with race, right? And I speak to how for norms that are used to help us, categorize and say, okay, these individuals are Black, so we need norms that are geared towards Black individuals. These individuals are Latin or Latinx. We need norms there. We need norms for individuals of Asian descent. But that doesn't really capture the broad spectrum of diversity within those groups, right? There's so much heterogeneity, differences between groups, but then there's so much within group differences. And so what I think about the intersectionality is thinking about multiple identities that intersect, that impact, just development in general, not just brain development, but I'm thinking about, race, class, and gender. Those are intersecting identities. And so all of those things need to be taken into consideration when you have an individual in front of you, and you're trying to figure out, educational plans, how to help from a social work perspective, how to treat those individuals medicine wise, and how to help them in their cognitive development. And so I think, it's a framework that invites us to think more comprehensively about the work we're doing and considering all factors, for me specifically, that could lead to diagnosis, right? So if someone is in front of me who is of a Latin or Latinx culture, who I need to know, okay, were you born in the United States, or were you born from another country or from another region or place in the world? When did you start learning English? Are you bilingual? What's your level of acculturation? Those are the factors and those intersecting identities that have to be taken into consideration, because we know that those things impact cognitive development and cognitive abilities. So it's really just asking us to take a more comprehensive view of individuals, and then expanding it from a viewpoint that we just aren't accustomed to.
What you're saying just reminded me of a story of a coach. She's an Iranian descent, and coaching was not even her primary role, but she decided to help a young woman she encountered who was a first generation college goer, and who was not very keen on going to college because she found the process intimidating. But this Iranian this lady shared her perspective that when she came to US when she was I think in her early teens,
Mm-hmm.
and what she found that on college essay the question was something like, so she said, I had witnessed bombing. I had witnessed families being dragged out of homes. I had witnessed having to live in a shelter and hide for 20 straight days.
Mm.
And not a single question on my college essay probed into my psychology, my personal experience, or my diversity. And what she ended up writing was literally her, I think, I forget, like going to a local restaurant and ordering food or something like that, because the prompt was such. So yeah, you're right. We're missing out on people's rich experiences that shape their worldview, and this need to mainstream everybody, maybe, as you said, may help the brain to automatize its process and save fuel or glucose on the brain, but we may be actually short-circuiting some of the ways to grow our heart.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that thought process.
Absolutely. And I think you brought up a great example in terms of admissions process and things like that. And thinking about, we use certain tests to help us with admissions process. And there's research showing that, like, hey, those tests might not be as great as we think they are. And what are the other metrics that we're going to use to help us, who's a quality candidate for, getting into a university or this fellowship or these things. And it's like, those are the things that stand out. I would love to hear about her experiences. That is, while traumatic, it's an amazing experience. And I'm sure there's an amazing story behind the fact that this person who has experienced these traumas is applying for college and in the position she is. I want to talk to her.
Yes,
I want to teach her.
Yes, but it's nowhere it's mentioned that that's what makes you the most desirable candidate, right?
Right.
Like, I remember when I applied for grad school coming from India, I literally read the previous year's student's essay and I mimicked it, because I wanted to be so cautious that I wanted to let them hear what they wanted to hear, but
Mm-hmm.
I was misinformed about what my story might be very valuable. Like having grown up, like my experience with people with disabilities, and my experience of having how community supports people with disability would have been such a great essay to write about.
Yeah.
But I was never encouraged, or there was no admission process that said, that's what we want to know about you. To your point about this framework that McCormick talks about, participants are multidimensional. Participants' social group membership are dynamic. Power is a feature of participants' intersectional positions. And last one, which is participants' intersectional positions create outcomes of systemic advantages and disadvantages. What a great way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So as we close our interview, I'm always curious, my amazing guest, what has shaped their thinking about things? And so, do you have any recommendations for our audiences about books that have influenced you and shaped your thought process?
Yeah, I was just thinking about some, and one that I read later in life, in terms of probably started reading it 4 or 5 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, was it's a book called Cry Like a Man by Jason Wilson.
Oh, wow.
And he's a Black author, and he talks about his story of upbringing and issues related to emotional expression as Black men. Believe it or not, that's an issue in terms of the idea that, showing emotion and that emotional intelligence, being able to describe how you feel. For the longest time, I was not the most in-depth in my emotional understanding. Yet I'm a psychologist, which is interesting in another aspect. But just like in relationships and being able to tell people and say, what is it exactly I'm feeling? Like, I don't have the words to say how I'm feeling. And in the book, he talks about how that led him down certain paths and how that impacted his relationships. And I think it's a great book, particularly for me, but also for Black men in terms of just understanding more about emotions and openness with discussing those emotions and talking about them.
Love that.
Yeah. And then one that I've read growing up was the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley.
Yes.
And, a phenomenal book that just looks at his growth. If you want to talk about trajectory, his trajectory was fundamentally changed in so many ways. And I'll reference just one aspect of he was the son of a preacher growing up. And his father was very much of I guess you would say, a Black nationalist perspective, but teaching independence and to Black men probably in the 1930s, or in a time where his father speaking on the things that he was speaking on was problematic. And so Malcolm X's father, or Malcolm Little at the time, his father was supposedly committed suicide by falling on a railroad track. So what the story is that he was killed. And this happened when Malcolm was, a teenager or a young boy. And so it talked about him and his brother, or him and his siblings, being taken away from his mother. Her ending up, because of all of those things, having mental health issues, having to go into a psychiatric institution. They wouldn't give them the insurance money from his life insurance plan because they said that he killed himself. And all this in the setting of a time where Black people were considered second-class citizens. And so he went into a life of crime, ended up in jail, and then the rest is history in terms of his trajectory. And you think about how great, we talk about Malcolm X in terms of his thinking and his just the wisdom that he had, regardless of your views on his beliefs and things like that. He still became something great. Just think if he didn't have those life experiences where his father was taken from the family and those things that traumatically impacted his trajectory, how great he could have been outside of what he was already great. Right.
Wow.
And it just speaks to, for me, just like there are so many great people out here who just need opportunity, need some things to go right in their life. And we need to be able to help support people so that they can fulfill their potential, because there's so many people out here with so much potential. And there are so many things in the way that we could really just, if we could just fix on a humanity level.
Yes.
We could see so much change in the world.
Well, I 100% agree. And thank you for sharing these amazing recommendations. I am going to get both these books for myself. And once again, such a joy and pleasure to talk to you. And folks, that's all the time we have today. Thank you again, Willie, for being my guest and sharing your wisdom and your perspective, and particularly giving us a view of hope. I really think the work that you're doing is, to me, is going to have a deep and wide impact, and I thank you for that. And for you, listeners, definitely keep listening. Thank you for joining us week after week. If you love what you're listening to, share this episode with your friends and colleagues, and give us a thumbs up or a rating. That's how people find us. We are being listened to in 110 countries because of you, and because of that sharing that you do, it gives us the opportunity to bring on these amazing guests. So thank you, and until then, see you here again next time on Full Prefrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.